I walked into the restaurant expecting a warm welcome, but instead my mother-in-law shot me a cruel smile, her voice dripping with disdain. "Maybe a dive bar suits you better," she sneered. I didn't flinch. I just asked for the manager. But what she didn't know was I wasn't here to beg for a seat. I was here for something much more unforgiving. "You're not actually on the guest list, ma'am." The hostess at the Alcott looked at me with barely concealed pity as she scanned her reservation book for the third time. Behind her, through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see my husband's entire family already seated at their usual corner table, wine glasses raised in what looked like a toast. Without me, my stomach dropped to my designer heels. This wasn't a mistake. This was planned. "Try Morrison," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "The reservation might be under Morrison." She flipped through pages with manicured fingers, shaking her head. "I have Morrison party of 6. But the notes here specifically say no additional guests." No additional guests. I watched Daniel laugh at something his brother James had said while Margaret, my mother-in-law, dabbed her lips with a linen napkin. They looked like a magazine advertisement for family perfection. Except the family was missing one person, and that person was standing in the lobby like an unwelcome stranger. "My name is Betty Sullivan, though I've been Betty Morrison for 5 years. I'm 32, I live in Cincinnati, and until this exact moment, I thought I understood my place in the Morrison family hierarchy. Apparently I was wrong about everything. The Morrison family operates like a corporation with Margaret as the CEO. She's 63, silver-haired, and has the kind of old money elegance that comes from generations of never having to check price tags. Her late husband left her comfortable, and she spent the last 15 years making sure everyone knows it. She speaks in measured tones about appropriate behavior and family standards, while wielding charity work like a weapon of social destruction. When Daniel first brought me home 5 years ago, I thought I could win her over with respect and patience. I was 27, fresh out of graduate school, and naive enough to believe that love could bridge any gap. I dressed conservatively, spoke softly, and never contradicted her even when she made comments about working-class values that were clearly aimed at me. See, Margaret discovered early on that I'd worked my way through college managing a small family restaurant. To her, this meant I was beneath her son's station. She never said it directly, but her message was clear in every interaction. The way she introduced me to her friends as Daniel's little girlfriend, even after we were engaged. The way she somehow forgot to include me in family photos. The way conversations stopped when I entered a room. Daniel always made excuses. "She's just protective of the family. Give her time to adjust. You know how mothers can be with their sons." 5 years of excuses while I watched his family treat me like a temporary inconvenience they hoped would disappear. What they didn't know was that I'd been quietly building something while they dismissed me. While Margaret was planning charity luncheons and Daniel was struggling to make his consulting business profitable, I was investing in real estate and developing business relationships that would make their trust fund money look like pocket change. But I kept quiet about my success. I'd learned that mentioning my business ventures made Daniel uncomfortable, like he thought I was trying to compete with him. So I downplayed everything, let him believe his income was supporting our lifestyle, and built my empire in the shadows. Tonight was supposed to be different. Daniel had mentioned this dinner 3 days ago, right after finishing a phone call with James that ended abruptly when I walked into the room. "Family dinner Thursday," he'd said without looking up from his laptop. "The Alcott at 7:30. I'd been excited. The Morrison family dinners were rare, usually reserved for major announcements or celebrations. I thought maybe they were finally ready to accept me as part of their circle. I should have known better when Daniel seemed nervous all week. Tuesday night, I caught him having a hushed conversation in his study after he thought I'd gone to bed. Wednesday morning he was unusually distant, checking his phone constantly and giving me vague answers when I asked about his day. This morning I'd spent 2 hours getting ready. I chose a conservative black dress that Margaret couldn't criticize, paired with the pearl necklace Daniel gave me for our wedding anniversary. I wanted to look perfect to finally earn their approval. Standing in that restaurant lobby watching my husband's family celebrate without me, I realized how foolish I'd been. This wasn't about earning acceptance. This was about putting me in my place once and for all. The hostess cleared her throat. "Is there anything else I can help you with?" Through the window I saw Margaret lean over to whisper something to Daniel. He glanced toward the lobby and for just a moment our eyes met through the glass. Instead of surprise or concern, I saw something that made my blood freeze. Relief. Like he was glad I was standing out here instead of sitting at their table. Actually, I said to the hostess, straightening my shoulders, could you tell me if Marcus Bell is working tonight? She blinked in surprise. Mr. Bell? The owner? I think he's in the kitchen. May I ask what this is regarding? I smiled, and for the first time all evening it felt genuine. Tell him Betty Sullivan is here. He'll want to see me. The Morrison family thought they knew who they were dealing with. They thought I was just Daniel's working-class wife who'd gotten lucky. They had no idea that the woman they'd been dismissing for 5 years was about to remind them that respect isn't inherited. And tonight they were going to learn exactly what they'd been underestimating. The hostess disappeared toward the kitchen, leaving me standing alone in the Alcott's opulent lobby. I'd been here twice before for Morrison family celebrations, but tonight the restaurant felt different. More intimidating. The marble floors stretched endlessly beneath soaring ceilings adorned with crystal chandeliers that probably cost more than most people's cars. Each table was set with bone china and sterling silver that caught the light from the massive windows overlooking the Ohio River. This was Margaret's world. Old money, established families, the kind of place where conversations were conducted in hushed tones about stock portfolios and summer homes. The clientele moved with the practiced ease of people who'd never worried about money, never questioned whether they belonged. Women in designer dresses that cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. Men in suits tailored to perfection, discussing business deals over $30 appetizers. I caught my reflection in one of the polished brass accents near the entrance. My black dress suddenly felt like a costume, my carefully applied makeup like war paint for a battle I was already losing. The pearl necklace Daniel had given me for our anniversary seemed to mock me now, a cheap imitation of the real jewelry adorning the other women in this room. Earlier, when I'd handed my keys to the valet, his expression had been polite but puzzled. My 3-year-old Honda Civic looked distinctly out of place among the Mercedes, BMWs, and Lexuses in the lot. He'd probably wondered if I was lost, if I'd confused this place with somewhere more appropriate for someone like me. What he didn't know was that I owned 3 rental properties in Cincinnati's most desirable neighborhoods. What he couldn't see was the investment portfolio that grew larger every month while Daniel struggled to keep his consulting business afloat. What nobody in this restaurant realized was that the woman they were dismissing could probably buy and sell half the people dining here tonight. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I had a perfect view of the Morrison family table. They occupied the corner booth that Margaret always requested, the one with the best view of the river and maximum visibility to the other diners. James sat across from his wife Linda, both of them animated and laughing. Michael, Daniel's younger brother, was gesturing enthusiastically about something while his girlfriend Sarah nodded along. And there was Daniel, my husband of 5 years, looking more relaxed than I'd seen him in weeks. He wasn't checking his phone nervously or drumming his fingers on the table like he'd been doing all week. He looked comfortable. At peace. Like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Margaret presided over the table like a queen holding court. Her silver hair was styled in perfect waves, her navy dress impeccable. She held her wine glass with the casual elegance of someone born to this lifestyle, someone who'd never had to learn the proper way to hold expensive stemware because she'd been doing it since childhood. They'd ordered wine without waiting for me. The bottle sat in an ice bucket beside the table, probably some vintage that Margaret had selected to impress the other diners. The menus were open, the bread basket had been passed around, and the conversation flowed easily. They looked like a family advertisement for prosperity and happiness. Except one chair was noticeably empty. I watched Daniel glance at his watch, then look directly toward the lobby where I stood. Our eyes met through the glass, and instead of the surprise or concern I expected, I saw something that made my chest tighten. He looked relieved. Not guilty, not embarrassed, but actually relieved that I was standing out here instead of sitting at their table. That's when I heard her voice behind me. "Oh, Betty. What a surprise." I turned to find Margaret Morrison standing 3 feet away, having approached from the bar area with the silent grace of a predator. She was holding a martini glass, her smile perfectly practiced and completely cold. Her timing was impeccable as always. She'd been watching from somewhere in the restaurant, waiting for exactly this moment when I'd be most exposed and vulnerable. "Margaret," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady. I was just asking about the reservation. Were you? She tilted her head with mock concern, the same expression she used when discussing disappointing charity auction results. How unfortunate. There must have been some confusion. The way she said confusion made it clear there was nothing confusing about this situation. Every detail had been planned with military precision. The timing of the dinner invitation. Daniel's nervous behavior all week. The specific instruction to the hostess that there would be no additional guests. I don't understand, I said, though I was beginning to understand perfectly. Margaret's smile widened, showing teeth as white and sharp as porcelain. Oh, darling. Surely you realize that not every family gathering requires everyone's presence. Sometimes it's important to maintain certain standards. The words landed exactly as she intended them to. Not just as an exclusion, but as a public education about my place in the Morrison family hierarchy. She'd chosen the busiest night of the week, the most visible location in the restaurant, and the exact moment when I'd be most humiliated to deliver this lesson. Other diners were beginning to notice our conversation. A couple at the nearest table had stopped talking and were watching with barely concealed curiosity. The hostess station was within earshot, and I could see the staff exchanging glances. Daniel mentioned this was a family dinner, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Family, Margaret repeated, savoring the word. Yes, well, I suppose that term means different things to different people, doesn't it? Through the window I saw Daniel check his watch again. Not because he was wondering where I was, but because he was timing this encounter. He knew exactly how long it would take for his mother to find me, to deliver her message, and to send me away properly chastened. The realization hit me like cold water. This wasn't just Margaret's cruelty. This was a coordinated effort. Daniel had been part of this plan from the beginning, maybe even the architect of it. All those nervous phone calls, the hushed conversations, the way he'd avoided my eyes when mentioning dinner, it was all preparation for this moment. My own husband had orchestrated my public humiliation. Margaret took a delicate sip of her martini, letting the silence stretch between us like a taut wire. When she spoke again, her voice carried just loud enough for the nearby tables to hear every carefully chosen word. You know, Betty, there's a lovely sports bar just down the street. Much more your speed, I'd imagine. She paused, her eyes scanning my dress with theatrical concern. They probably have those chicken wings you're so fond of. And beer on tap. The reference wasn't accidental. Last Christmas, when I'd mentioned growing up helping my parents run their small neighborhood restaurant, Margaret had latched onto that detail like a bloodhound. She'd spent the entire evening making pointed comments about blue-collar establishments and appropriate dining experiences for different backgrounds. Now she was weaponizing that same information in front of a restaurant full of Cincinnati's social elite. The couple at the nearest table had abandoned all pretense of minding their own business. The woman leaned forward slightly, her diamond earrings catching the chandelier light as she strained to hear every word. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable somewhere that serves food you can actually pronounce, Margaret continued, her voice dripping with false sympathy. I'd hate for you to feel out of place ordering something you've never heard of. Through the window I could see the Morrison family table. James was covering his mouth with his napkin, but his shoulders were shaking with barely suppressed laughter. Michael had turned slightly in his seat to get a better view of the lobby, his girlfriend Sarah following his gaze with wide eyes. Linda, James's wife, was studying her wine glass with intense fascination, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. Daniel. My husband sat perfectly still, watching this public destruction of his wife with the same expression he wore when reviewing quarterly reports. Detached. Analytical. Like he was observing a business transaction rather than watching his mother systematically tear apart the woman he'd promised to love and honor. The hostess had returned from the kitchen and was hovering near her station, clearly aware that something was happening but uncertain how to handle it. Two waiters had paused in their duties, pretending to arrange napkins while listening to every word. Even the bartender had slowed his movements, polishing the same glass for the third time. I'm sure there are establishments more suited to your background, Margaret continued, each word precisely calculated for maximum impact. Places where you can feel authentic. Where you belong. The word belong landed like a physical blow. This wasn't just about excluding me from one dinner. This was about erasing 5 years of trying to find my place in this family. This was Margaret making it crystal clear that I would never be good enough, never be worthy, never be anything more than an embarrassing mistake her son had made. But as I stood there, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes on me, something else began to build inside my chest. Not the crushing shame Margaret expected, but something harder. Something that had been growing quietly for months as I watched Daniel struggle with his business while I built mine in secret. I thought about my grandmother who'd raised 3 children alone after my grandfather died in a factory accident. She'd worked 2 jobs, put all her kids through college, and never once let anyone see her cry. Never give them the satisfaction, Betty, she used to tell me. They can take your money, they can take your pride, but they can't take your strength unless you hand it to them. Margaret was waiting for me to crumble. She expected tears, apologies, maybe even anger that would prove I was exactly as unsuitable as she'd always claimed. What she didn't expect was for me to straighten my shoulders and smile. "How thoughtful of you to be concerned about my comfort," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the lobby. "But I think I'll stay." Margaret's perfectly composed expression flickered for just a moment. This wasn't going according to script. The growing audience around us seemed to lean in collectively. The woman at the nearby table whispered something to her companion. A server walking past slowed his pace, pretending to check his section while staying within earshot. "I'm sorry," Margaret said, her tone suggesting she'd misheard. I said I'll stay. "But thank you for the recommendation about the sports bar." I paused, letting my own smile widen. "I'm sure you speak from experience about places that serve beer on tap." The subtle dig about Margaret's own humble origins, carefully buried under decades of acquired sophistication, found its mark. Her grip tightened almost imperceptibly on her martini glass. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," she said, her voice losing some of its earlier confidence. "No misunderstanding at all," I replied. "I understand perfectly. You want me to leave quietly to save face for everyone involved. You want me to accept that I don't belong here with your family in your world." The lobby had grown noticeably quieter. Even conversations at distant tables seemed to have died down as people became aware that something significant was happening near the entrance. Margaret's eyes narrowed. "I want what's best for everyone, including you." How generous. I glanced toward the family table where Daniel was finally looking directly at me. His expression was unreadable, but I could see tension in the set of his shoulders. It must be exhausting always knowing what's best for everyone else. "Betty," Margaret said, her voice taking on a warning tone. But I was done being warned. Done being managed. Done pretending that their approval mattered more than my own self-respect. "You know what, Margaret? You're absolutely right about one thing. I don't belong here." I gestured toward the opulent dining room, the crystal chandeliers, the tables full of people who'd inherited their place in the world rather than earning it. "But not for the reasons you think." Something in my tone must have registered, because Margaret's confident smile began to fade. For the first time since this conversation started, she looked uncertain. The hostess chose that moment to return, slightly out of breath. "Mrs. Sullivan? Mr. Bell will see you now. He's very excited that you're here." Margaret's face went completely blank. "Bell. Marcus Bell," I said calmly. "The owner. He's an old friend." And that's when Margaret Morrison realized she'd made a very serious mistake. The kitchen doors burst open with theatrical timing, and Marcus Bell emerged like he was stepping onto a stage. At 55, he still moved with the energy of someone half his age, his salt and pepper hair perfectly tousled and his chef's coat pristine despite having just finished the dinner rush. But it was his face that made the entire lobby freeze, pure, unfiltered joy. "Betty Sullivan." His voice boomed across the restaurant, causing conversations at every table to stop mid-sentence. "My God, woman, you're a sight for sore eyes." Margaret's martini glass trembled in her hand. The confident smirk she'd worn while humiliating me cracked like old paint. Marcus strode across the marble floor with his arms wide, completely ignoring Margaret's presence as he wrapped me in a bear hug that lifted me off my feet. When they told me Betty Sullivan was in my lobby, I thought they were pulling my leg. "What's it been, 2 months since we closed on the Nashville property?" 6 weeks, I said, savoring every syllable as Margaret's face went progressively paler. "But who's counting?" Right. Time flies when you're building an empire." Marcus set me down but kept his hands on my shoulders, beaming like a proud father. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced to the now silent restaurant, "allow me to introduce the woman who made all this possible." Betty Sullivan, my business partner and the genius behind the Alcott's entire concept. The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret looked like she'd been slapped with a frozen fish. Business partner? She whispered, the words barely audible. Marcus turned to her with the polite curiosity reserved for strangers. I'm sorry, are you a friend of Betty's? I'm her mother-in-law, Margaret managed, though she sounded like she was introducing herself to an alien species. Margaret Morrison, I said smoothly. Marcus, Margaret's been a regular customer here for years. She absolutely loves what we've done with the place. The irony wasn't lost on anyone within earshot. Margaret had indeed been bragging about the Alcott to her country club friends for months, claiming it as her personal discovery. She'd name-dropped her connection to Cincinnati's most exclusive restaurant, at every social gathering, never knowing she was actually promoting my business. Marcus's eyebrows shot up. The Margaret Morrison? The one who always requests table 12 and orders the 2019 Bordeaux. He turned to me with barely concealed amusement. Betty, you didn't tell me your mother-in-law was one of our VIP customers. It never came up, I said, watching Margaret's carefully constructed world crumble in real time. The hostess, suddenly understanding why her manager had literally run to get Mr. Bell, began fluttering around us like an anxious butterfly. Mrs. Sullivan, I'm so sorry about the confusion with the reservation. If you'd like, I can arrange a table immediately. Our best table. That's very kind, but I was actually hoping to join my family. I gestured toward the corner booth where the Morrison clan sat frozen like deer in headlights. If that's still possible. Through the window, I could see Daniel's face cycling through emotions like a broken traffic light. Confusion, fear, and something that looked suspiciously like panic. James had stopped laughing entirely, his mouth hanging slightly open. Michael was leaning forward, straining to hear every word of this conversation that was rewriting everything he thought he knew about his brother's wife. Marcus clapped his hands together. Of course. Roberto, he called to the nearest waiter, please escort Mrs. Sullivan to her table and make sure she gets the full VIP treatment. Anything she wants, and I mean anything, is on the house tonight. Roberto, a young man who'd been watching this entire scene unfold with growing amazement, practically bowed. Of course, Mr. Bell. Right this way, Mrs. Sullivan. But Margaret wasn't finished. Despite the growing crowd of onlookers and her obvious humiliation, she made one last desperate attempt to regain control. I think there's been some mistake, she said, her voice shaking slightly. Betty works in consulting. Marcus laughed, a rich sound that carried across the restaurant. Consulting? Well, I suppose that's one way to describe it. Betty consulted with me on every aspect of this restaurant. The wine program, the interior design, the kitchen layout, even the staff training protocols. Hell, she consulted me right into the most profitable restaurant in Cincinnati. Profitable? Margaret's voice was barely a whisper now. Most profitable in the city, Marcus confirmed cheerfully. And that's just our flagship location. We've got 2 more opening next year, Nashville and Louisville. Betty's handling the expansion personally. The woman at the nearby table was no longer pretending not to listen. She was openly staring, her fork suspended halfway to her mouth. Her dinner companion had given up all pretense and was leaning back in his chair to get a better view of the proceedings. But she managed a restaurant, Margaret stammered, grasping for anything that might restore her understanding of the world. Managed? Marcus looked genuinely confused. Betty didn't manage anything. She owned it. Turned a struggling neighborhood place into a gold mine, then sold it to invest in high-end hospitality. That's how we met, actually. She approached me with the concept for the Alcott 3 years ago. Margaret's knees seemed to give out slightly. She reached for the hostess station to steady herself. 3 years ago, she repeated mechanically. Best business decision I ever made, Marcus continued, oblivious to Margaret's mental breakdown. Betty's got an eye for what works and the capital to make it happen. We wouldn't be where we are without her vision and her investment. The word investment hit Margaret like a physical blow. All those conversations about Daniel supporting his wife, about Betty being lucky to marry into their family, about working-class people knowing their place. All of it based on a fundamental misunderstanding of who held the real power in this relationship. Roberto cleared his throat politely. Mrs. Sullivan? Your table is ready whenever you are. I looked at Margaret one final time. Her perfect composure had completely shattered, leaving behind a woman who looked lost and small despite her expensive clothes and practiced elegance. "Thank you, Roberto. I think it's time I joined my family for dinner." As we walked toward the Morrison table, I could hear Margaret behind us, trying to process what had just happened. But I was already focused on what came next. Because if Margaret thought learning about my business partnership with Marcus was shocking, she had no idea what other surprises the evening had in store. Daniel was about to discover that the quiet, accommodating wife he thought he knew was actually the financial backbone holding his entire world together. Roberto guided me through the restaurant like I was visiting royalty, pulling out my chair with a flourish that made Daniel's eyes widen. The Morrison family table, which had buzzed with comfortable conversation moments earlier, now felt like a courtroom waiting for verdict. "So," I said, settling into my seat and accepting the wine list Roberto offered with reverent hands, "what did I miss?" The silence stretched until James cleared his throat. "Betty, we had no idea you knew Marcus Bell." "Really?" I opened the wine list, though I already knew every selection by heart since I'd helped curate it. "I thought Daniel might have mentioned it. We've been business partners for 3 years. Margaret had followed us to the table and stood hovering beside it like a ghost, still clutching her martini. Her earlier confidence had evaporated completely, leaving behind a woman who looked genuinely lost. "Business partners," Daniel repeated slowly like he was testing foreign words. "Emamoom." I closed the wine list and looked directly at him. "Though I suppose we never really talked much about my work, did we? You always seemed so busy with your consulting firm." The way I said "your" made Daniel's jaw tighten. There was something in my tone that suggested ownership might not be as clear-cut as he'd assumed. Roberto reappeared with a bottle of wine I hadn't ordered. "Compliments of Mr. Bell," he explained as he began the opening ritual. "The 2018 Chateau Margaux. He said you'd appreciate the selection." Linda, James's wife, finally found her voice. "That bottle costs $800. Does it?" I accepted the wine for tasting, swirled it professionally and nodded my approval. Marcus always did have excellent taste. We spent months choosing the wine program for this place. Michael leaned forward, his medical student curiosity finally overcoming his shock. "What exactly do you do, Betty? I mean, besides the restaurant business?" I took a sip of the wine, letting them wait. "Investment consulting primarily. Real estate development. I have a portfolio of properties throughout Cincinnati." "Properties?" Margaret had finally found her voice, though it sounded strained. 17 at last count." I set down my wine glass and watched their faces carefully. "Commercial mostly, though I do have some residential holdings." James laughed nervously. 17 properties? Come on, Betty, you don't have to exaggerate." Instead of responding, I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. A few taps brought up my property management app, which I turned toward him. The screen showed a list of addresses, property values, and monthly rental income that made his face go pale. "The Morrison Building on 4th Street, I said casually. "Where your accounting practice is located." "That's mine. Has been for 2 years." James's fork clattered against his plate. "That's impossible. We pay rent to Morrison Property Holdings, which is a subsidiary of Sullivan Investments. My company." I scrolled through the app. "Your rent checks have been going into my personal account for 24 months. Thank you for always paying on time, by the way." The table had gone completely silent. Even the neighboring diners seemed to sense something significant was happening and had lowered their voices. "But that means..." James's voice trailed off as the implications hit him. "It means your sister-in-law is your landlord," I said simply. "Though I suppose that makes family dinners a bit awkward now." Margaret finally took her seat, moving like a woman in shock. "This is ridiculous. If you had that kind of money, why wouldn't you say something?" "Why would I?" I met her gaze steadily. "You all seemed so comfortable with your assumptions about who I was. I didn't want to disrupt that." Daniel was staring at me like I was a stranger who'd stolen his wife's face. "Betty, I don't understand. Where did this money come from?" "Hard work. Smart investments. The restaurant I sold before we met? I didn't just manage it, Daniel. I owned it. Bought it for $50,000, turned it profitable, and sold it for $400,000 3 years later." $400,000? Michael's voice cracked slightly. "That was just the down payment on my real estate portfolio. I turned to him with a smile. Speaking of which, Michael, how are your student loans coming along? He blinked in confusion. Actually, they're gone. Some anonymous benefactor paid them off last year. We never found out who. That's wonderful, I said warmly. Medical school is so expensive. How much was it? 250,000. 260 actually. But Betty, why are you asking about? The words died in his throat as understanding dawned. His face went through several color changes before settling on ash gray. You, he whispered. Anonymous benefactor seemed like such a cold term, I said. I prefer to think of it as investing in family. Margaret's wine glass hit the table harder than intended, sending Bordeaux splashing across the white tablecloth. You paid Michael's medical school debt? Among other things. I looked around the table, meeting each of their stunned gazes in turn. Let's see what else. Oh, Robert's law firm. 2 years ago when Patterson Industries threatened to sue over those billing irregularities. Margaret's face had gone completely white. The settlement. You said an anonymous client contributed. $200,000, I confirmed. Saved the firm's reputation and prevented a very messy lawsuit that would have destroyed Robert's practice. That was you, Daniel said slowly. That was me. I took another sip of wine. Though I noticed Robert got quite a bit of praise at Christmas dinner for handling that crisis so skillfully. The silence that followed was broken only by the soft clink of silverware from other tables. The Morrison family sat frozen, their entire understanding of their world crumbling like a house of cards in an earthquake. But why? Margaret finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Why help us if we, Phi? Because I loved Daniel, I said simply. And because I thought family meant something to all of you. Daniel's hand moved toward mine across the table, then stopped as if he was afraid to touch me. Betty, I had no idea. All this time you've been supporting your family while you planned ways to humiliate me? I finished gently. Yes, Daniel. I have been. The weight of that revelation settled over the table like a heavy blanket, and I realized we'd reached the point of no return. I reached into my purse again, this time pulling out a leather portfolio that Daniel had seen me carry to business meetings but never questioned. The Morrison family watched with growing unease as I opened it and began laying documents on the table between the crystal glasses and silver flatware. Since we're having such an honest conversation, I said, placing the first document in front of Daniel, I thought you might want to see this. Daniel's face went from pale to gray as he read the corporate filing papers. Morrison Consulting LLC. Primary investor and majority stakeholder. His voice faltered. 70% ownership, Betty Sullivan. 70%, I confirmed. I believe that makes me the controlling partner in your business, Daniel. James leaned over to look at the document, his accounting background making him read faster than the others. This is dated 3 years ago. Betty, you've owned Daniel's business for 3 years. Technically, I founded Daniel's business 3 years ago. I placed another document on the table. Initial capital investment $200,000. Ongoing operational support, another $150,000 over 3 years. Office lease, equipment purchases, software licenses, marketing budget. I looked at Daniel, whose mouth was opening and closing like a fish out of water. Did you really think your consulting fees were covering all those expenses? Margaret finally found her voice, though it sounded strained. But Daniel's been successful. He's landed major clients. Has he? I pulled out another folder, this one thick with correspondence. Patterson Industries, my introduction through Marcus Bell's restaurant group. Hartwell Manufacturing, I met their CEO at a real estate investment conference. Riverside Development, they're one of my commercial tenants. I spread the emails across the table like playing cards. Each one showed the careful cultivation of business relationships, the strategic introductions, the behind-the-scenes work that had built Daniel's client roster. Every major account your husband has, Margaret, came through my network. Every contract renewal, every project extension, every referral. Daniel thought he was building his reputation. I looked directly at my husband. He was actually building mine. Daniel's hands were shaking as he picked up one of the emails. You introduced me to Patterson, but they called me directly. After I suggested they might need consulting services and mentioned I knew someone who could help. I pulled out my phone and showed him my contact list. Would you like to see how many of your clients I have on speed dial? Linda, who had been silent through most of this revelation, spoke up with barely controlled panic. James, if Betty owns the building where your practice is. Oh, she does more than own it, I said, placing a lease agreement in front of James. She's been subsidizing your rent for 3 years. Market rate for that space is $4,500 a month. You've been paying $1,800. James's face went completely white. That's not possible. The lease clearly states. Read the fine print, James. Specifically the section about rental assistance programs for qualifying small businesses. I pointed to a clause buried in the legal language. Turns out your sister-in-law qualified you for a family discount. Margaret was gripping her wine glass so tightly I worried it might shatter. How much? How much money have you put into this family? I reached for my phone and opened my financial management app, scrolling through 3 years of transactions. Interesting question. Let's see. Daniel's business startup and ongoing support, $350,000. James's rent subsidies, $96,000. Michael's medical school debt, $260,000. Robert's legal settlement, $200,000. Margaret's charity fundraising shortfalls. What about my charity work? Margaret interrupted. The Morrison Foundation for Children's Education. When you fell short of your fundraising goals 2 years running, someone made anonymous donations to cover the difference. $60,000 each year. I showed her the donation receipts. I couldn't let you lose face with your charity board friends. Michael was doing math in his head, his medical training making him quick with numbers. That's over $1 million. $1.2 million to be precise. I closed the app and looked around the table. Plus interest on various loans, property management fees I've waived, and business opportunities I've directed toward Morrison Family Enterprises rather than my other investments. The restaurant around us seemed to fade away as the full scope of what I was revealing sank in. Other diners continued their conversations, servers moved efficiently between tables, but at our corner booth, the Morrison family was experiencing a complete upheaval of everything they thought they knew about their lives. But why? Daniel finally managed. Why keep it secret? Why not tell us? Because I wanted to see if you'd value me for who I am, not what I could do for you. I began gathering the documents. Unfortunately, tonight answered that question. Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. What are you saying? I'm saying the Morrison family financial ecosystem has been built on my goodwill for 3 years. And goodwill, Margaret, can be withdrawn. I pulled out a final document, a legal notice I'd had prepared weeks ago but hoped I'd never need to use. Effective immediately, I'm exercising my right as majority stakeholder to dissolve Morrison Consulting LLC. I'm terminating the rental assistance program for James's practice. I'm calling in the loans I've made to various family members. You can't do that, James protested. I have clients' obligations. You have 30 days to secure alternative arrangements. I suggest you start making phone calls. I stood up, my movements calm and deliberate. Michael, your future student loan payments will need to come from other sources. Robert, you'll need to find a new funding source for client settlements. Daniel grabbed my wrist. Betty, please. We can work this out. I didn't know. That's the problem, Daniel. You didn't want to know. I gently removed his hand from my arm. You were all so comfortable believing I was beneath you that you never bothered to look up. I placed one final document on the table, a business card with my name and title. Betty Sullivan, CO, Sullivan Investment Group. I'm giving you all one choice. You can acknowledge what I've done for this family, treat me with the respect I've earned, and we can restructure these arrangements as legitimate business partnerships. Or you can continue believing I'm not good enough for the Morrison name, and I'll redirect my investments to people who appreciate them. The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret stared at the business card like it was written in a foreign language. James was frantically calculating numbers on his napkin. Michael looked sick. Daniel just sat there, finally understanding that the quiet wife he'd taken for granted held the power to destroy everything he'd built. The choice is yours, I said, picking up my purse. But choose quickly. I have other opportunities to consider and my patience has limits. I gave them 24 hours to respond. 24 hours to show me that 5 years of marriage and family meant something more than their wounded pride. They chose silence. The next morning, I drove to the downtown high-rise I'd purchased 6 months earlier under my maiden name. Margaret had been so vocal about that particular property when Daniel mentioned it in passing, calling it unnecessarily ostentatious, and the kind of place where new money goes to show off. She'd convinced him we didn't need that much space, that it would send the wrong message about our priorities. What she didn't know was that I'd bought the penthouse anyway, furnishing it slowly over the months as my private sanctuary. A place where Betty Sullivan could exist without the weight of Morrison family expectations. The elevator ride to the 40th floor felt like ascending from one life into another. Behind me lay the modest Oakley house where I'd played the role of dutiful daughter-in-law. Above me waited a space that reflected who I really was: floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Ohio River, modern furniture that I'd chosen myself, art that spoke to me rather than to some imagined social standard. By 10 a.m. I was seated at my home office desk, making the phone calls that would dismantle everything I'd built for the Morrison family. Patterson Industries, this is Tom Patterson. Tom, it's Betty Sullivan. I need to discuss your consulting contract with Morrison Consulting. Betty. Good to hear from you. How's the restaurant business? Expanding beautifully, thank you. But I'm calling about Daniel. I'm afraid I'll need to withdraw my recommendation for contract renewal. The pause on the other end was telling. Tom Patterson wasn't stupid, he'd always known the connection between his lucrative consulting deal and his relationship with me. I see. Any particular reason? Let's just say our business philosophies have diverged. I'll be happy to recommend some alternative firms who can provide the same level of service. Of course. I appreciate the heads up, Betty. 3 similar calls later, Daniel's client roster had been reduced by 80%. Each conversation was professional, courteous, and absolutely devastating to the business I'd spent 3 years building for my husband. My phone started ringing within an hour. Betty, what's happening? Patterson just called to cancel his contract. Daniel's voice was strained, desperate. He said you recommended he work with someone else. I let the call go to voicemail. Then I changed my number. The second call I made was to Robert Morrison's biggest client, a development company that had been using his legal services for 2 years. The client relationship had been rocky, with several disputes over billing practices, but my quiet intervention and occasional financial backing had kept things stable. Barbara, it's Betty Sullivan. I wanted to give you a heads up that I'll no longer be providing oversight for the Morrison account. Barbara Chen's sigh was audible through the phone. Honestly, Betty, we've been concerned about some irregularities. Without your involvement. I understand completely. I can recommend several excellent firms who might be a better fit. By lunch, Robert's law practice had lost 3 major clients. The cash flow crisis would hit within weeks. Michael's situation required a more delicate touch. I called his malpractice insurance company, identifying myself as the anonymous benefactor who had been covering his premiums. I need to terminate the payment arrangement effective immediately, I told the representative. Of course, Mrs. Sullivan. Should we notify Dr. Morrison about the change? He'll figure it out when his next premium notice arrives. The afternoon was spent making social calls to various charity boards and country club committees where the Morrison name had carried weight for decades. These conversations were more subtle but equally effective. Margaret Morrison? Oh yes, lovely woman. Though I understand there have been some financial changes in the family recently. Nothing scandalous, of course, just shifts in priorities. You know how these things go. The Cincinnati social scene operated on whispered implications and carefully planted doubts. By evening, Margaret's carefully cultivated reputation as a philanthropist and social connector would be quietly questioned at dinner parties across the city. My phone had been ringing constantly throughout the day. Daniel's desperation was escalating with each voicemail he left. Betty, please call me back. I know you're angry, but we can fix this. The clients are canceling everything. I don't understand what's happening. I went by your office. They said you don't work there anymore. Where are you? I'd anticipated this. That morning, I'd formally dissolved my consulting arrangement with the small firm where I'd maintained a professional address. No forwarding information had been provided. By 5 p.m., Daniel was showing up at buildings I owned, trying to track me down through property management companies. He didn't realize that Sullivan Investment Group operated through a network of shell companies and legal representatives. Finding me would require resources he no longer had access to. The evening news brought an unexpected development. A brief segment about Cincinnati's changing business landscape mentioned several major consulting contracts being transferred to new firms. Daniel's former clients were already moving forward without him. My landline rang, a number Daniel had forgotten existed. "Betty, I'm standing outside what used to be your office. The security guard says you haven't worked here in months. What's going on?" I picked up the phone for the first time since leaving the restaurant. "Hello, Daniel. Thank God. Betty, where are you? We need to talk. This is insane. You can't just destroy everything we've built together. Everything you built was built with my money, my connections, and my planning. I'm simply redirecting my investments. But we're married. We're a team." The irony of those words, coming 24 hours after he'd participated in my public humiliation, wasn't lost on me. Were we a team when you helped your mother exclude me from dinner? Were we a team when you sat there watching her try to destroy me? I didn't know she was going to do that. I thought it was just what, Daniel? Just a little harmless humiliation? Just putting me in my place. The silence stretched between us. When he finally spoke, his voice was smaller. "I never knew about the money. About what you'd done for my family. Because you never asked. In 5 years of marriage, you never once asked what I actually did for work. You were comfortable thinking I was beneath you. That's not true. Isn't it? When was the last time you asked about my day? When did you last show interest in my business meetings? When did you ever treat me like an equal partner instead of a convenient accessory?" Another long pause. "Betty, please. Come home. We'll figure this out." "I am home, Daniel. For the first time in 5 years, I'm exactly where I belong." I hung up and turned off the phone. Outside my windows, Cincinnati's skyline sparkled in the gathering darkness. Somewhere in the city, the Morrison family was beginning to understand the true cost of their arrogance. But my work wasn't finished yet. 3 months later, I stood in the heart of Nashville's music district, watching Marcus put the finishing touches on our new restaurant's wine display. The space was everything the Elcott had been, but with a warmth and authenticity that came from building something without compromise. "Betty, you have to see the reservation book," Marcus called from behind the bar, his excitement infectious. "We're booked solid through New Year's and we haven't even officially opened yet." The Nashville project had been my escape plan, developed quietly during those final months of my marriage when I'd sensed the inevitable confrontation coming. While Daniel's family had dismissed me as an unsuitable wife, I'd been creating something that would prove exactly who I really was. "The wine program is perfect," I said, running my fingers along the carefully curated bottles. "Better than Cincinnati. That's because we're not trying to impress anyone this time. We're just being ourselves." The truth of that statement resonated deeper than Marcus realized. For the first time in years, I was building something as Betty Sullivan, not as Daniel Morrison's accommodating wife. The restaurant reflected my vision without the constant pressure to tone down my ideas or make them more palatable to the Morrison family's conservative tastes. Opening night arrived with a buzz of anticipation that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with the restaurant business. Local food critics, Nashville's business elite, and music industry professionals filled every table. The energy was electric, conversations flowing as smoothly as the wine I'd personally selected. By midnight we knew we had something special. The till showed numbers that made Marcus's eyes widen, but more importantly the atmosphere felt right. This wasn't just a successful restaurant. It was proof that I could create something magnificent when I stopped hiding my talents. Within 6 months, our profit margins exceeded everything Daniel's consulting firm had achieved in 3 years. The irony wasn't lost on me that while he struggled to rebuild his decimated business, I was thriving in an industry he'd once dismissed as beneath our social station. The call from Food and Wine magazine came on a Tuesday morning in early spring. I was reviewing quarterly reports when my assistant announced that a senior editor wanted to discuss featuring our restaurant in an upcoming issue about innovative women entrepreneurs. "We're particularly interested in your background," the editor explained during our phone interview. "Our research shows you have quite a story of business success that extends beyond the restaurant industry." The resulting article, published 2 months later, changed everything. The 6-page spread featured glossy photos of our Nashville restaurant alongside a detailed profile of my business empire. For the first time, Sullivan Investment Group's extensive holdings were laid out for public consumption. The piece described my anonymous support of Cincinnati businesses, carefully protecting the privacy of individual clients while making it clear that I'd been a major financial player in the region for years. The final paragraph mentioned my recent divorce from a prominent Cincinnati family, and my decision to redirect her investments toward new ventures. Within hours of the magazine hitting newsstands, my phone was ringing with interview requests, business propositions, and partnership opportunities. The woman who had once been excluded from family dinners was suddenly being courted by Fortune 500 companies. The Cincinnati Business Journal picked up the story within days, running their own investigation into Sullivan Investment Group's local impact. The article revealed the full scope of my property holdings, business partnerships, and charitable contributions, painting a picture of an entrepreneur who had been operating at the highest levels while maintaining complete anonymity. Margaret Morrison's name appeared in the follow-up pieces, but not in the way she was accustomed to. Society columnists began questioning how such a prominent family had failed to recognize the financial powerhouse in their midst. The narrative shifted from Betty Sullivan's remarkable success story to the Morrison family's spectacular failure of judgment. James called me on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after the Food and Wine article appeared. "Betty, it's James. I wanted to congratulate you on the magazine feature." His voice carried a strained politeness that hadn't been there during our family dinners. The balance of power had shifted so dramatically that he was now the one seeking my approval. "Thank you, James. How's the accounting practice?" "Actually, that's why I'm calling. We've had to relocate to a smaller space. The rent on the Morrison building was..." He trailed off, realizing the awkwardness of complaining about my business decisions to me personally. "I heard you found something more suitable. Strip mall in Norwood, isn't it?" The silence told me everything I needed to know about how far the Morrison family had fallen. James Morrison, who had once hidden laughter while his mother humiliated me, was now operating his reduced practice from a budget office space between a nail salon and a tax preparation service. Michael's situation had played out similarly. Without anonymous financial backing, his medical practice had struggled with overhead costs. He'd been forced to join a larger practice as an associate physician rather than maintaining his independent status. Robert's law firm had survived, barely, but the prestigious downtown offices were gone. His client base had shrunk to small-time personal injury cases and basic legal services, a far cry from the high-profile corporate work that had once defined his practice. And Daniel? According to mutual acquaintances, he'd taken a job with a larger consulting firm, working as a junior associate for a fraction of his previous income. The man who had once sat silently while his family diminished me was now answering to supervisors and scrambling for billable hours. The strangest part was how little satisfaction their downfall brought me. I'd expected triumph, vindication, the sweet taste of revenge served cold. Instead, I felt something closer to indifference. Their struggles seemed small and distant compared to the expansive life I was building. Standing on my Nashville restaurant's rooftop terrace one evening, looking out over a city where my name commanded respect rather than tolerance, I realized the real victory wasn't their failure, it was my freedom. 6 months after leaving Cincinnati, a handwritten letter arrived at my corporate office. Daniel's familiar handwriting filled 3 pages with apologies, explanations, and pleas for reconciliation. He described his family's regret, their newfound understanding of what they'd lost, their hope that we could find a way forward together. I read the first paragraph, then set the letter aside. Later that evening, I threw it away without finishing it. My story had never been about the family that failed to see my worth. It was about the empire I built after I stopped hiding my light under their basket. It was about learning that respect isn't something you earn through accommodation. It's something you command through excellence. The woman who had once accepted humiliation at the Elcott was gone. In her place stood someone who owned the conversation, controlled the narrative, and built success on her own terms. And that, I realized, was the ultimate revenge, becoming so magnificently myself that their opinions no longer mattered. Which moment hit you the hardest, Betty's humiliation at the restaurant or her ultimate triumph? Share your favorite part in the comments below. If this story of strength and justice inspired you, smash that like button and subscribe for more empowering tales. Your support means everything.